In this episode, we'll look at the tragic case of a young mother, Denise Amber Lee, who was abducted from her own home in broad daylight. In the aftermath of her violent death at the hands of her captor, police and 911 protocols were heavily criticised, and a new state law was passed in 2008 to standardise training for 911 dispatch employees, named after Denise. But does it go far enough? It was 17th of January 2008, and in the city of Northport, on Florida's west coast, a teenage girl was watching TV at a relative's home in Latour Avenue. It was a quiet street, and at around 2 p.m, she heard a car cruising up and down the road, so she looked out of the window and spotted a two-door dark green 1990s Chevrolet Camaro. Was the driver looking for a particular address? When the car passed by for the fourth or fifth time, Jennifer decided to go outside to see whether they needed help, or if they were up to something suspicious. As she stepped outside, she noticed the car pull into the driveway of Nathan and Denise Lee's 3-bedroom rental house, so she went back inside, assuming that the man in the Chevy Camaro was a friend of theirs who was visiting for the first time and didn't know the road. Around 30 minutes later, Jennifer noticed the car driving away, but thought no more of it until later. Meanwhile, 23-year-old Nathan Lee was on his way home from his job as a meter reader for Florida Power and Light. He had called his wife, 21-year-old Denise, at around 11 a.m. that morning and reminded her to open the windows instead of turning on the aircon, as it was a hot day and they were on a tight budget. He tried to call her again at around 3 p.m, just as his shift was ending, but she didn't answer. This was unusual, but he wasn't too worried, as he assumed his wife was just busy with the kids. She was a stay-at-home mum to their sons, one of whom was 2 years old and the other just 6 months. He tried again a few more times during the 30-minute drive home, but when she didn't pick up, he became increasingly concerned. When he arrived home, he knew something was very wrong. The windows were shut and the front door was locked. Inside, he found the children sitting up together in the crib. Their diapers were soiled, but Denise was nowhere to be found. Nathan knew she would never have left the boys alone willingly. He immediately called 911 to report his wife missing, and then phoned his father-in-law, Rick Goff, who had worked in law enforcement for 25 years and was currently a sheriff's lieutenant in a neighbouring county. When the police arrived at the home, they found no signs of forced entry and nothing had been stolen. Denise's car keys, car, mobile phone and purse were all still present. They knocked on neighbours' doors to find out if they had seen or heard anything, and Jennifer was able to tell them about the green car she had seen that afternoon. She had observed that the driver was a heavy-set man with blonde hair, and that the car had a car mask attached to the front bumper to prevent stone chips. Police immediately notified the local press about the vehicle they were searching for, and ramps to the I-75 highway were monitored in case the suspect tried to get out of Northport. A helicopter searched from above, while a canine unit scoured every inch of the ground below. Sometime between 5:30 and 6 p.m, a man named Michael King visited his cousin Harold Muxlow and asked to borrow a shovel, flashlight and gas can, as his lawnmower was stuck in his yard. Harold was happy to lend him the tools, but as he walked outside with Michael to say goodbye, he heard a woman's voice screaming, "Call the cops." It sounded like it was coming from Michael's car. Harold asked what was going on, and Michael replied, "Nothing, don't worry about it." Harold went back inside but looked out of the window to keep an eye on what was going on, and noticed Michael struggling with a young woman in the back seat before driving away. Harold was concerned and drove to Michael's house to check whether his lawnmower really was stuck in his yard. If it wasn't, it would prove he was lying. When he arrived in Sardinia Avenue, just a few miles away, he was concerned to find there was no lawnmower in sight. He was now certain that his cousin was involved in something serious, but he didn't know what to do. He called his 17-year-old daughter Sabrina and told her about what he had seen, but advised her not to call the police. Sabrina sensibly ignored her father's warning and called 911 at 6:20 p.m. Just a few minutes before, at 6:14 p.m, a chilling call had already come in to 911. The voice of a scared young woman was heard saying, The dispatcher tried to communicate with her, but when the woman ignored her and a man's voice was heard in the background, they realised that she must have been taken against her will and was cleverly trying to notify the police by covertly using a phone. The woman was begging to be released, and it sounded like they were in a moving vehicle with a radio playing in the background. The dispatcher asked for the woman's name, and she replied indirectly, as if pleading with her captor.
Please, my name is Denise. I'm your beautiful husband, and I just want to see my kids again.
But when the dispatcher asked for her surname, and she replied Lee, the man realised what was going on and shouted, "Where's the phone?" The last thing the dispatcher heard were the woman's terrified words.
Are you going to hurt me? Are you going to let me out now? Oh, please.
The phone went dead, but not before the dispatcher managed to put a trace on the call. Unfortunately, the phone was a cheap prepaid one and didn't have a GPS locator, so the police could only confirm that it had pinged off the Northport Tower and were unable to get a clear location. But what they did find was that the phone was registered to 36-year-old unemployed plumber Michael King. King had no criminal record, and the missing woman's family had never heard of him before, so they had no idea why he would have wanted to abduct their beloved Denise. By now it was horribly clear that she was in terrible danger, and time was of the essence if there was any hope of finding her safe and well. A call soon came in from a woman named Janet Kowalski, who had been travelling southbound along Highway 41 when she saw a troubling sight. While stopped at a traffic light, she heard a blood-curdling scream coming from the dark-coloured Camaro next to her, and then noticed a small hand pounding on the glass. The male driver was trying to push the person down in the back seat. Concerned that a child had been kidnapped, she tried to slow down to let the car pull in front of her so she could follow it, but it didn't pass and pulled in behind her. Kowalski stayed connected to the 911 operator and gave updates on where the car was travelling. As she was speaking, the green car suddenly changed lanes and turned left onto Toledo Blade Boulevard, heading towards the I-75. The concerned woman asked the dispatcher if she should follow the vehicle, but it was too late to make the turn and the vehicle had vanished out of sight. The dispatcher failed to record and route the call correctly, so this vital information was not passed on to the police until it was too late. At 6:50 p.m, another call came into 911 from a payphone, this time from Harold Muxlow. He had searched his conscience and decided to call the police after all to report the unsettling experience with his cousin. Investigators hurriedly obtained a search warrant and rushed to King's home in Sardinia Avenue. The house was empty, but the TV was still on, as if the inhabitant had left in a hurry. In the kitchen, they found a roll of silver duct tape and a rubbish bag in the pantry containing several light brown hairs stuck to more pieces of duct tape. More strips of tape were found in the bedroom, and a blood-stained Winnie the Pooh blanket lay on the floor, looking eerily out of place. It was quickly confirmed that the hair belonged to the missing young woman, Denise Amber Lee. It was clear that Michael King was the man they were looking for, but where was he? At 9:10 p.m, Deputy Christian Weimer and State Trooper Edward Pope spotted a 1995 green Camaro which looked like the one they had been asked to watch for. Holding their breath, they quickly checked the license plate number against the details they had been given. It was Michael King's vehicle, and it was heading onto the I-75 southbound.
Officer in pursuit.
They turned on the sirens and accelerated onto the highway in pursuit of the Camaro. Pope overtook the vehicle and pulled in front of it in a tactical position to conduct a felony stop. He drew his weapon and ordered the driver to exit the vehicle, noticing as he did so that the blonde-haired man inside perfectly resembled the picture on Michael King's driving license. There was no question that it was him. King refused to come out, and after 5 more unanswered requests, Pope swallowed hard and warned the driver that he had just one more chance. If he didn't get out of the car, he would have no choice but to fire into the vehicle. King finally saw that his time was up, and he opened the door and reluctantly climbed out.
Suspect in custody.
The fugitive wore jeans and a camouflage shirt, and his entire bottom half was soaking wet. He had mud all over his shoes, and he was carrying a cell phone with the battery and SIM card removed. There appeared to be hairs and blood on the car mask at the front of the Camaro, along with a viscous substance that Pope couldn't immediately identify. Inside the car, there was a petrol can on the passenger seat and a phone battery on the floor. Disconcertingly, there was a blanket and a ring on the back seat, along with a mud-covered shovel. There was no sign of Denise in the car, but her family confirmed that the ring was hers. Michael King was taken into custody, where he told police a fantastical tale about him and Denise being kidnapped by a stranger who offered them a ride. He claimed that their captor had let him go first, so he had no idea where Denise had been taken after that, and he even said that it was his idea for Denise to call the police in the hope they could both be rescued. He declined a polygraph test and refused to say any more until his lawyer arrived. He was charged with kidnapping, but police still had no clue as to Denise's whereabouts, and her family were beside themselves with worry. On Friday, 18th of January, a searcher hit upon a disturbing discovery. On a patch of land near Plantation Boulevard in Northport, there was an area where the earth had recently been disturbed, with 2 small piles of sand nearby that were speckled with blood. A crime scene technician deduced that the blood had been on the ground, then someone had tried to cover it up with sand, having not realised that sand absorbs blood. A forensic team set to work the next day to excavate the area. Just over 3 feet down, they discovered what everyone had been dreading. It was the nude body of a young woman, lying on her side in a fetal position. There was a gunshot wound on the side of her head, and a 9mm shell casing was found in the grass nearby. The body was confirmed to be that of Denise Amber Lee. It was now the grisly job of the forensics experts to piece together what had happened and to capture the evidence that would take Michael King to trial. Denise had been tied up, raped, sodomized, then shot. The location of the entrance wound, just to the side of Denise's eyebrow, told them that if her eyes had been open, she would have been able to see the gun that was being held to her head. When the bullet was fired, it caused her eye to explode, which led them to conclude that the viscous fluid found at the front of King's car was ocular fluid from the victim's eye. The medical examiner also found aspirated blood in her lungs, so she had been alive for at least a few moments after receiving the gunshot wound. Semen was found on Denise's clothing and in her vagina, which matched Michael King's DNA profile with such certainty that the results definitively excluded 3.5 trillion other individuals. A palm print found on the outside of the driver's side window was identified as belonging to Denise, and the blanket on the back seat contained her DNA and blood. Strands of Denise's hair were also found in the car, which experts believed she had deliberately pulled out and left there to try to help investigators. The case was further strengthened with Harold MacLeod's identification of the mud-covered shovel as the one he had lent to King on 17th of January, and Janet Kowalski identified Michael King from a lineup as a man who had been driving the car she had been following. King's trial took place in August 2009, and despite the weight of evidence against him, he pleaded not guilty. Denise's husband and family listened courageously to the horrendous details, then wept as the guilty verdict was read out. He was sentenced to death by lethal injection for kidnapping, sexual battery, and first-degree murder. The whole community struggled to understand why a man who had no criminal record could suddenly become a killer. 36-year-old King had moved from Michigan to Florida in 2002, and his friends and family described him as a nice, modest guy. He didn't drink alcohol or take drugs, and he had been married with 2 children, but was now divorced. However, despite his outwardly normal appearance, stories had emerged during the trial which showed episodes of deviant behaviour throughout his life. After watching the Texas Chainsaw Massacre at the age of 17, he had bought a chainsaw and chased his family with it, his facial expression frighteningly blank. Later, at his Florida home, neighbours had accused him of peeping into their windows at night, and a woman who ran a local hair salon had witnessed him kissing a girl who looked to be only 13 or 14 years old. Another woman testified that King had sexually assaulted her, but she had been too scared to report it at the time. 90 minutes before kidnapping Denise, he had been at a gun range practicing his shooting. The defense put forward a head injury he had suffered at the age of 7, leading to frontal lobe damage, as a possible explanation for his actions. Michael King appealed his conviction, but the sentence was upheld, and as of 2023, he remains on death row in Florida. Denise's funeral was filled with mourners paying their respects, and it seemed that almost everyone in the entire town of Northport attended. The nature of the crime had shocked everyone to the core, and it was impossible to understand how a quiet, loving young mother could have been abducted from the safety of her own home at random, then raped, murdered, and buried in a shallow grave, while her 2 young children cried out for her in their crib at home. Her devastated husband, Nathan, filed an intent to sue the county for failing to save Denise, shocked and disappointed by the fact that Janet Kowalski's information had not been followed up due to poor call handling and miscommunication. If the police had responded more quickly to her report of a kidnapped victim in a green Camaro on the highway, was there a chance that Denise could have been saved? Denise's father campaigned for a new state law to standardise training for 911 dispatch employees, and the Denise Amber Lee Act was passed in April 2008. Sadly, her family believes it doesn't go far enough, as the training and certification is optional. As they continue to mourn their loss and watch as her two young sons grow up without their mother, they will continue to push for it to be mandatory, in the hope that such a mistake can be prevented from ever happening again. Thank you for listening to this episode of Prash's Murder Map. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. This case was taken from my true crime book, I Just Wanted to Kill. For news about my books and free true crime blog posts, check out my website, www.prashganandran.com. I really appreciate your support, and I'll see you again soon.